The universe, according to Jackson Thorne, was mostly made of grease, leaking hydraulics, and things that refused to fit into other things. At least that was the universe at the edge of the Rimward territories. He was currently lying on his back in the belly of a decommissioned transport ship on the mining moon of Ureos, staring at a manifold that looked like it had been chewed by a vacuum slug. If you leak on my face one more time, you rusted bucket of bolts, I am going to sell you to the scrap dealers in Sector 7, Jackson muttered. His voice echoed against the metallic ribs of the ship, sounding tinny and tired. The transport, a battered hauler known as the Driftwood, responded by dripping a single, lukewarm drop of synthetic oil onto the bridge of his nose. Jackson sighed, wiping the smudge away with a rag that was more dirt than fabric. He had spent the last 6 hours trying to bypass the safety protocols on the evacuation pods. The official manual said it was impossible. The official manual also assumed that you weren't currently standing on a moon that was scheduled to suffer atmospheric collapse in 48 hours. He slid out from under the machine, his boots clicking against the frost-dusted floor of the hangar. The air on Ureos tasted like recycled ozone in desperation. Around him, a small team of engineers moved with the sluggish precision of men who hadn't slept in 3 days. "Commander, we have a problem," a young technician named Kale said, approaching with a data slate that flickered with a dying battery. "Kale, we have a moon full of problems," Jackson replied, rolling down his sleeves. "Give me the one that is currently on fire. The extraction list. The High Command ordered us to prioritize the mineral crates in Vault 4. If we take those, we have to leave behind the families in the sub-level nurseries. There isn't enough weight allowance for both." Jackson took the slate, his eyes scanning the numbers. It was a classic calculation of the Bastion Null High Command. Profit versus pulse. The minerals were worth 3 million credits. The families were worth a footnote in a quarterly report. He tapped the slate against his chin. "How many crates in Vault 4? 22, sir. All refined cobalt. And how many nurseries? 6. 42 children, 30 adults." Jackson looked toward the horizon, where the sun of Arios was beginning to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the cratered landscape. "If we vent the cooling fluid from the secondary engines and strip the armor plating from the cargo bay, we can make the weight." The technician stared at him. "Sir, if we strip the armor, the re-entry into the atmosphere will be a nightmare. The ship will vibrate like a dying bird." "We might lose the engines." "We might," Jackson agreed. "But birds are designed to fly, even the dying ones. The cobalt isn't. Vent the fluid. Strip the bay. If anyone asks, tell them the armor was compromised by radiation. But High Command is 5 light-years away and currently eating a very expensive dinner," Jackson interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. "I am here. You are here. The families are here. Move." The technician hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded and ran toward the engine room. Jackson watched him go, feeling the familiar weight of a decision that would likely end his career. This would be the 18th time he had deviated from direct orders to ensure a zero-casualty extraction. He was already the most decorated failure in the fleet. He walked toward the hangar mouth, looking up at the stars. Somewhere up there, hidden behind layers of harmonic static and iron-bandaged continents, was Bastion Null, the center of the galaxy's defensive network, a world that valued walls more than the people they protected. A sudden, sharp hum resonated through the air. It wasn't the sound of an engine or a moonquake. It was a high-frequency pulse that made the fillings in his teeth ache. Jackson stiffened, his hand moving instinctively to the sidearm at his belt. A shimmering pillar of blue light erupted in the center of the hangar. It was a long-range teleportation beam, the kind used only by the royal envoys of the Thaloris line. The miners and engineers stopped in their tracks, shielding their eyes from the glare. When the light faded, a figure stood there. He was dressed in the silver and black livery of the Bastion Null Archive, his posture so stiff it looked painful. 2 combat drones hovered behind him, their optic sensors glowing a cold, clinical red. "Lieutenant Jackson Thorne?" the envoy asked, his voice echoing with the distorted resonance of the planet's harmonic dampeners. Jackson didn't salute. He looked at the grease on his hands, then at the immaculate silver of the envoy's uniform. I am a little busy with a planetary collapse, he said. Can this wait? It cannot. I am here on behalf of Regent Alara Thaloris. Jackson felt a cold prickle of unease. The Regent? I haven't even finished the report for this moon yet. If this is about the cobalt, it is not about the cobalt, the envoy said, stepping forward. He held out a crystalline scroll, the seal of the Thaloris family glowing with internal heat. Your presence is required at Bastion Null immediately. You are being summoned for a permanent reassignment. Jackson took the scroll, the heat from the crystal seeping into his skin. Why me? I'm just a glorified mover with a bad attitude. The envoy paused, a flicker of something like confusion or perhaps pity crossing his face. The Regent has reviewed your service history, specifically your reports on the Kestrel drift extraction. Jackson winced. That report was mostly a complaint about the quality of the synthetic coffee. The Regent found it insightful, the envoy replied. He gestured toward the teleportation beam, which was beginning to cycle again. You have 10 minutes to gather your belongings, Lieutenant. I don't need 10 minutes, Jackson said, looking back at the transport ship where Kel was already beginning to strip the armor plating. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small battered wrench. He tossed it to the technician, who caught it with a look of shock. Keep the engines running, Kel, Jackson called out. And don't forget the families. He turned back to the envoy, his jaw set. If the Regent wants to yell at me for the coffee, tell her I prefer to do it in person. As he stepped into the light, Jackson felt the familiar pull of the void. He didn't know that he was leaving behind the dirt and grease of the frontier for a world where the air was made of silence and the wars were fought with shadows. He only knew that for the first time in his life, someone had read his words and seen something other than a mistake. The light swallowed him, and the moon of Ureos vanished into the dark. Bastion Null did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them. From orbit, the planet looked like a metallic heart wrapped in a cage of glowing ribs. The lithic resonators, massive towers that pierced the atmosphere, hummed with a frequency that kept the surrounding space in a state of perpetual acoustic interference. It was a world designed to be heard but never understood. Inside the central archive, miles beneath the planetary crust, Regent Alara Thaloris stood in a chamber of floating light. The air here was perfectly still, scented with the faint, metallic tang of ionized data. Around her 10,000 records drifted like ghosts, each one a pulse of light representing a life, a ship, or a failure. Your Highness, the High Council is waiting, a voice whispered from the shadows. It was Counselor Vane, a man whose skin was as gray as the stone walls of the Fauji. He moved without sound, his long ears, a trait of the founding colonists, twitching at the faint vibrations of the data streams. Let them wait, Alara said without turning. Her fingers danced through the air, pulling a specific file toward her. The file was small, less bright than the others. It belonged to a man named Jackson Thorne. Most of the entries were red: disciplinary warnings, missed quotas, unauthorized use of fuel. But beneath the red was a pattern of green that no one else had noticed. 17 extractions, Alara murmured. Her voice was a low melody, one of the few things on Bastion Null that didn't sound distorted by the static. 0 casualties. In 3 of those instances, he was ordered to abandon civilians to save strategic assets. He refused. He is an insubordinate technician, Vane said, his ears flattening against his head. A man who prioritizes sentiment over the security of the Fauji. Admiral Korv has already nominated 3 candidates for the Siphon Initiative. Heroes of the Third Expansion. Men who know how to win. They know how to conquer, Vane, Alara replied, her eyes narrowing as she read a footnote about a complaint regarding trade tariffs on an asteroid colony. There is a difference. Our Fauji is strong, but it is brittle. We build walls higher, but we forget why we are inside them. She flicked her hand, and the file expanded. Footage of Jackson Thorne appeared. He was standing on a smoking dock, his face covered in soot, arguing with a superior officer. He looked tired, stubborn, and entirely unimpressed by the medals on the other man's chest. He looks like a man who would rather fix a landing strut than lead a fleet, Vane observed with a sneer. Precisely, Alara said. He sees the cracks. Most commanders only see the flags. The chamber doors hissed open, and a wave of sound rushed in, the distant rhythmic thud of the planetary cannons calibrating. Ilara felt the vibration in her marrow. The Siphon Initiative was her attempt to change that rhythm. Instead of a shield that repelled, she wanted a system that absorbed and redirected, a system that required a mind that understood the value of what was being protected. She closed the file and turned to face the counselor. Is the summons complete? The transport cruiser Resolute Dawn is currently in orbit. The lieutenant should be on the surface within the hour. Good. Notify the ceremonial office. I want a formal announcement. Vane blinked, his ears twitching in surprise. A formal announcement for a lieutenant's reassignment? The council will find that unusual. They will find it shocking, Ilara corrected him, a faint cold smile touching her lips. Because I am not just announcing a commander. I am announcing a union. The counselor's jaw dropped. Your Highness, surely you don't mean... I mean that Bastion Null requires a new doctrine, Ilara said, her voice turning to ice. And a doctrine is only as strong as the blood that signs it. I will marry this man, and he will lead the siphon. She walked past the stunned counselor, her long robes trailing like a shadow across the floor. She could feel the data streams around her whispering, the collective pulse of 10,000 lives sensing a shift in the frequency of their world. Outside the archive, the HFY waited. It was a place of iron and silence, a world that had forgotten how to sing. Ilara reached up to touch the tapered edge of her ear, feeling the faint tremor of the planet's heartbeat. I hope you like silence, Lieutenant Thorne, she whispered to the empty air, because you are about to become the loudest thing on this planet. 2 hours later, the grav lift in the Grand Bastion hissed open. Jackson Thorne stepped out, blinking at the sudden opulence of the royal level. He still smelled of synthetic oil and frontier dust. His uniform was wrinkled and his boots had a visible crack in the heel. He was met by a phalanx of guards in obsidian armor. They didn't speak. They simply gestured for him to follow. The throne room was not a room at all, but a massive observation deck overlooking the planetary shield arrays. The sky above was a web of shifting blue light, beautiful and terrifying. At the center of the deck stood Ilara. She looked different than the hollows. She was smaller, more fragile-looking, but her presence filled the space like a physical weight. Her ears were long and elegant, angled forward as she watched the shield cycle. Lieutenant Jackson Thorne, she said without turning. Your Highness, Jackson replied. He didn't bow, but he did stop walking. I'd salute, but I think I've got enough grease on my hands to ruin your floor. Ilara turned. Her eyes were a deep, luminescent violet, the color of a nebula. She looked at his hands, then at his eyes. I am told you think the coffee on Ureos is strategic necessity. It is, Jackson said, his voice dry, along with functioning life support and commanders who can count to 10 without using their fingers. Ilara's ears flicked, a gesture of amusement that he didn't yet recognize. You have a reputation for being difficult, Lieutenant. I have a reputation for being right, he countered. People usually find that more difficult. She stepped closer, the air between them vibrating with the hum of the HFY. I have a project, she said. It is called the Siphon. It is a defense system that does not kill, but preserves. It requires someone who knows that victory is only useful if someone is left to enjoy it. Jackson went still. Those were his words, from a report he'd written at 3 a.m. after the Kestrel Drift disaster. You read that? I read all of them, Ilara said. Every extraction, every refusal to leave a man behind, every complaint about the plumbing. Jackson rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. So you want me to build you a shield? I want you to lead my planet, she said. And because the council will not accept a lieutenant from the frontier, I have informed them that we are to be wed. The silence that followed was so absolute that Jackson could hear the sound of his own heart beating. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He looked for a joke, a trick, a hidden camera. He found only the steady, unyielding gaze of a woman who had decided the fate of a world. I think, Jackson said slowly, his voice cracking just a little, that you might have the wrong Thorne. I don't make mistakes with data, Lieutenant, Ilara replied, stepping even closer until she was only a few inches away, her ears angled toward his face, sensing the rapid pulse of his blood. And you are the most interesting data point I have ever found. What if I say no? Jackson asked, his survival instinct finally kicking in. Then you go back to Arraeos and watch the moon collapse, she said simply. But if you stay, we change the way this galaxy thinks about war. Jackson looked out at the glowing shield of Bastion Null. He thought about the families on the transport ship, the cobalt crates he'd left behind, and the thousands of people who would never have to die if a shield could actually save them. He looked back at Alara. Her ears were still waiting. I'm going to need a lot of coffee, he said at last. Alara smiled, and for the first time in centuries, the silence of Bastion Null felt like a promise rather than a prison. We have the best in the sector, she said. The Grand Council chamber of Bastion Null was a masterclass in atmospheric intimidation. It was a cavernous amphitheater carved from obsidian and veined with glowing conduits that hummed at a frequency specifically designed to vibrate the human sternum. On this world, silence was not merely the absence of noise. It was a pressurized environment, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums until the mind began to hear ghosts in the static. Jackson Thorne walked down the central aisle, his boots sounding like hammer blows against the polished stone. He felt like a grease smudge on a pristine lens. He had been given a formal uniform, a stiff, midnight blue tunic with silver piping, but he had refused to let the valets trim his hair or scrub the faint scent of ionized fuel from his pores. He wanted them to see the frontier. He wanted them to smell the reality of the people who lived outside their iron bandages. At the center of the room, on a raised dais, sat the 12 ministers of the High Council. They were relics of a bygone era, their long, tapered ears draped with heavy ceremonial jewelry, their eyes glowing with the faint, violet hue of extensive neural augmentation. In the center sat High Admiral Krell. Krell was a man who looked like he had been forged rather than born. His face was a map of old scars and medals, and his ears were notched from decades of orbital skirmishes. Beside him, looking entirely too calm, was Regent Alara Thaloris. She was the one who had dropped the kinetic bomb of a marriage proposal into the stagnant waters of Bastion Null politics. She watched Jackson's approach with an expression that was impossible to read, her ears angled in a neutral, attentive arc. Lieutenant Jackson Thorne, High Admiral Krell began, his voice amplified by the chamber's resonance until it sounded like falling boulders. You stand before this council to answer for a career defined by insubordination, resource mismanagement, and a blatant disregard for the standing doctrine of the HFY. Jackson stopped at the designated marker. He didn't bow. He didn't even blink. With all due respect, Admiral, I'd call it prioritizing results over paperwork. If you're looking for someone to sit in a chair and sign off on atmospheric losses, you picked the wrong gearhead. A ripple of static passed through the room, the sound of 12 ministers adjusting their neural links in collective irritation. Results? Krell leaned forward, his massive hands gripping the edge of the dais. Your record shows 17 successful extractions and 0 confirmed kills. In a galaxy where the dominion of Karth is breathing down our necks, you have spent 3 decades avoiding the enemy. You have spent more credits on civilian housing and coffee requisitions than some of our fleets spend on ammunition. It is harder to keep someone alive than it is to blow them up, Admiral, Jackson replied, his voice level but sharp. Any idiot with a pulse can pull a trigger and turn a city into a glass bowl. It takes actual work to pull a colony out of a collapse without a single casualty. I don't avoid the enemy. I just don't see the strategic value in filling the void with more corpses than it already has. Alara spoke then, her voice cutting through the tension like a silver wire. The lieutenant understands a fundamental truth that the council has forgotten. A HFY that only knows how to kill is eventually a HFY that runs out of things to protect. The Siphon Initiative is about changing the center of gravity. And this marriage? Minister Vane asked from the far left, his voice a thin, oily rasp. To bind the Thalaris bloodline to a frontier scavenger? It is an insult to the founders. Jackson glanced at Alara. He saw the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her ears pressed back against her hair for the briefest of seconds. He realized then that she was as much a prisoner of this world as he was. She was fighting a war of her own, and he was the only weapon she had left. Look, Jackson said, turning back to the council. I didn't ask for the shiny boots or the fancy title. and I certainly didn't ask for the regent to put a ring on it. But I've spent my whole life fixing things that were supposed to be broken. Your defense doctrine is FUBAR. You're building walls that are so heavy they're crushing the people inside. If you want to stop the Karth, you don't build a bigger wall, you build a better filter. Krell stood up, his height dominating the chamber. The siphon is a theory, Lieutenant, a dangerous one. If you fail, you don't just lose a colony. You lose Bastion Null. You lose the heart of our civilization. Are you prepared to carry that weight? Or will you retreat when the first shot is fired, as you have done 17 times before? I didn't retreat, Jackson snapped, the military slang of the frontier slipping into his speech. I dusted off. I got my people out of the kill zone because there was no tactical advantage to staying. If you think staying in a burning room until the roof falls on your head is courage, then you're just a static head who spent too long in a bunker. The room went silent. Calling the High Admiral of Bastion Null a static head was the equivalent of a death sentence in any other context. Ilara stood up, her hand resting on the console in front of her. The decision is made, she said, her voice echoing with the finality of a closing airlock. The Siphon Initiative begins today. Lieutenant Thorne will be promoted to Commander of the Adaptive Defense, and our Union will proceed at the winter solstice. If you wish to challenge my authority, do so now, or return to your stations and prepare for the simulation. Krell stared at Jackson for a long moment, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. One chance, Commander. If the first simulation shows even a 1% increase in risk to the core, I will have you stripped of your rank and sent back to the frontier in a cargo pod. I look forward to it, Admiral, Jackson said. Just make sure the pod has decent life support. I'm getting used to the oxygen up here. As the council dispersed, the heavy obsidian doors hissed shut, leaving Jackson and Ilara alone in the center of the vast chamber. The hum of the planet felt louder now, a rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with Jackson's heartbeat. You could have been a little more diplomatic, Ilara said, turning to him. Her ears were angled forward again, exploring the space between them. Diplomacy is for people who have time to waste, Jackson replied, loosening the collar of his tunic. I'm a technician, Regent. I call a broken pipe a broken pipe. Your High Admiral is a man who thinks war is a spectator sport. He is a man who has lost a lot of friends to the Karth, she said softly. On Bastion Null, grief is often disguised as armor. Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, beneath the lights of the chamber. She wasn't just a ruler, she was the architect of a vision that everyone else was trying to tear down. Why me? He asked, the question that had been eating at him since the moon of Ereos. You could have picked any officer with a clean record and a better haircut. I didn't need a clean record, Ilara said, stepping down from the dais until she was standing on the same level as him. I needed a heart that hasn't been hardened by the static. I needed someone who knows that everyone on a data slate represents a person breathing, hoping, and waiting to be saved. I read your reports, Jackson, not for the logistics, but for the footnotes. You wrote that victory is only useful if someone is left to enjoy it. He rubbed a hand over his face. I was tired when I wrote that. And hungry. It was the most honest thing written in the archive in 300 years, she replied. Come, the siphon won't build itself, and Krell isn't going to give us much time before he pulls the plug. As they walked toward the lift, Jackson felt the shift in the air. The frontier was behind him, but the real battle had just begun. He wasn't just fixing a ship anymore. He was trying to fix a culture that had forgotten how to value a single life. And for the first time, he realized that he wasn't doing it alone. The Siphon Laboratory was located in the sub-basement of the lithic resonators, a place where the heat of the planet's core felt like a living thing pressing against the skin. It was a chaotic tangle of quantum processors, energy conduits, and holographic displays that projected the complex geometry of Bastion Null's defense lattice into the air. Jackson was in his element. He had stripped off the formal tunic, wearing only a gray undershirt and his old cargo trousers. He was covered in a fine layer of sweat and silver dust, his fingers dancing across an interface as he recalibrated the energy flow of the secondary shield arrays. Ilara was there too. She had traded her ceremonial robes for a practical flight suit, her long ears twitching as she monitored the data streams through her neural link. She didn't just see the data, she felt it. To her, the defense grid was a symphony of vibrations, and right now it was hopelessly out of tune. The problem with the current system, Jackson said, gesturing to a red-tinted section of the holographic globe, is that it's rigid. When a Karth cruiser hits us with a plasma burst, the shield absorbs the energy and pushes back. It's a brute force struggle. The shield wins, but the feedback loop fries the local grid and vibrates the atmosphere until people's lungs start bleeding. It is a wall, Alara said, her eyes closed as she listened to the hum. A wall that eventually cracks. Exactly, Jackson said. So instead of a wall, we create a lens. When the plasma hits, we don't push back. We tilt the harmonic frequency of the shield and catch the energy. We slide it along the curve of the atmosphere and vent it into the secondary resonators. We turn their attack into our battery. It sounds like a magic trick, a voice rumbled from the doorway. It was Counselor Vane. He was accompanied by two technicians from the Traditional Defense Bureau, their expressions a mix of skepticism and suppressed hostility. Admiral Krell sent us to oversee the first integration test. He is concerned that your lens will leave the core sectors vulnerable to kinetic penetrators. The Admiral is always concerned, Jackson said without looking up. Tell him that if we keep the grid at its current rigidity, a sustained Karth bombardment will cause a tectonic shift that will drop his precious bunkers into the magma. At least with my way, the only thing that gets hurt is the enemy's pride. We are not interested in pride, Commander, one of the technicians said. We are interested in the survival of Bastion Null. This siphon doctrine is a retreat in everything but name. You are allowing the enemy to strike us. I'm allowing the enemy to waste their ammunition, Jackson corrected. In the frontier, we call it the dry run. You let the other guy empty his clip into the shadows while you're already behind him with a wrench. Ilara opened her eyes, her gaze sharp. The test will proceed. I have authorized the use of the decommissioned orbital station in Sector 9 as a target. If the siphon can redirect a simulated Karth volley without compromising the station's life support, then the doctrine stands. The technicians exchanged a look of doubt but began setting up the monitoring equipment. Jackson wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Alara. Her ears were angled toward him, a subtle sign of trust that he was beginning to value more than any commendation. Are you ready? She whispered. I've been ready since the moon of Orios, Jackson said. Let's show these static heads how a real engineer works. The simulation began. The air in the lab grew cold as the quantum processors ramped up to full power. On the holographic display, a simulated Karth fleet emerged from a warp point, their hulls glowing with the aggressive violet of charged weapon systems. Incoming volley, a voice announced over the intercom. 24 capital-class plasma bursts. Impact in 10, 9, 8. Jackson's hands moved with a fluid, practiced grace. He wasn't thinking about the council or the marriage or the politics. He was thinking about the flow of energy, the way a river bends around a stone. Initiating tilt, he said. Now. The holographic globe shimmered. Instead of the standard blue wall, the defense lattice turned a soft, iridescent gold. As the simulated plasma bursts struck, they didn't explode. They seemed to smear against the shield, their energy stretching and twisting as it was pulled into the harmonic channels of the siphon. The energy readings on the display spiked, then leveled off as the siphon redirected the force toward the lithic resonators. The simulated orbital station in Sector 9 remained green, its integrity holding at 100%. Look at the feedback loop, Ilara said, her voice rising with excitement. The local grid isn't surging, it's breathing. The technicians from the Defense Bureau were leaning over their consoles, their eyes wide. It's working, one of them muttered. The kinetic impact is zeroed out, but then the simulation threw a curveball. A secondary wave of missiles, unguided kinetic slugs, was launched from the Karth cruisers. They were old technology, simple and heavy, designed to punch through sophisticated shields that only looked for energy signatures. Warning, the AI intoned. Kinetic penetration detected in Sector 9. Impact in 5 seconds. The siphon can't catch slugs, Vane shouted, his voice high and panicked. It's an energy lens. You've left the station wide open. Jackson didn't panic. He had spent his life dealing with things that didn't go according to plan. He didn't try to redirect the slugs. Instead, he reached out and manually overrode the power flow to the station's maneuvering thrusters. "What are you doing?" Alara asked, her ears twitching in alarm. "I'm moving the goalposts," Jackson said. On the display, the orbital station gave a sudden, violent lurch. It didn't retreat. It pivoted, presenting its reinforced underside to the incoming slugs. The impact was loud, a dull thud that resonated through the laboratory, but the station's core remained intact. "Casualty report?" Ilara asked, her voice steady. "Zero," Jackson said, exhaling a long breath. "The underside of that station is nothing but recycled scrap and armor plating. We'll have to fix the paint, but nobody's breathing vacuum today." The room was silent for a long moment. Counselor Vane looked at the display, then at Jackson. "You moved the station. That is not a defensive maneuver. That is improvisation." "It's called saving lives, Counselor," Jackson said, turning to face him. "I could have turned up the shield and blown the grid, which would have killed the power to the station's life support. Instead, I took a dent in the armor and kept the oxygen flowing. That's the difference between your doctrine and mine. You care about the wall. I care about the people inside it." Vane didn't have a retort. He turned and left the chamber, followed by his technicians. Alara watched them go, then turned to Jackson. Her expression was no longer the mask of a regent. It was something softer, something more human. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Jackson corrected. "Your math held. My hands just followed the curve." She stepped closer to him, the heat of the resonators making the space between them feel intimate. "You risked the station to save the crew. Krell will call it a failure of the shield." "Then Krell is a fool," Jackson said. "A shield that requires you to sacrifice the people it's supposed to protect isn't a shield at all. It's just a very expensive coffin." Ilara reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. Her touch was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat of the lab. "You don't just fix machines, Jackson. You fix perspectives." "I'm just an engineer, Regent," he said, though he didn't pull away. "I see a problem. I find a solution." They stood there for a moment, two outliers in a world of iron and silence. Outside, the planet hummed, its static dampened by the success of their work. But in the shadows of the lab, a new frequency was beginning to form, a resonance between a woman who felt too much and a man who refused to stop caring. "We should get some sleep," Jackson said, finally stepping back. "We've got 48 hours before the formal announcement, and I have a feeling Krell isn't going to let us celebrate with a quiet dinner." Ilara nodded, her ears angling toward the door. "You're right. But Jackson?" "Yeah? The coffee in the Royal Kitchens is much better than Oreo's. I'll have a pot sent to your quarters." Jackson watched her go, a faint smile touching his lips. Maybe this marriage wouldn't be as foobar as he thought. As he walked toward the lift, he passed a small maintenance drone that was struggling to align a sensor plate. It bumped into a conduit and emitted a defensive chirp. "Easy there, little guy," Jackson said, reaching out to gently nudge the plate into place. "Don't fight the wall, just find the flow." The drone beeped in what sounded like gratitude and resumed its work. Jackson watched it for a second, then stepped into the lift. He was starting to realize that on Bastion Null, even the smallest things were worth saving, and that was a doctrine worth fighting for. The night cycle on Bastion Null was not a time of darkness, but a time of deeper luminescence. The shield arrays pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, casting long shadows of iridescent blue across the cities. Jackson sat on the balcony of his quarters, staring out at the armored horizon. He had a cup of the Regent's coffee in his hand, and for once, he didn't have to worry about synthetic oil dripping on his head. He thought about the simulation. He thought about the look on Vane's face when the station moved. It was a small victory, a single point of data in a vast, cold universe. But it was a start. He had spent his whole life avoiding the glory of war, preferring the quiet satisfaction of a zero-casualty extraction. He had been called a coward, a scavenger, and a ghost. But as he sat there listening to the hum of the planet, he realized that he wasn't running anymore. He was standing his ground. He was building a lens. And through that lens, he was finally starting to see a future that didn't end in fire. Jackson took a sip of the coffee. It was excellent, smooth, dark, and rich with the flavor of a world that still had a soul. He looked up at the stars, wondering if the Karth were watching, wondering if they knew that the HFY was changing its tune. "Let them come," he whispered to the silence. "We're ready for the flow." The doors behind him opened, and a servant entered to clear the tray. "Everything to your satisfaction, Commander?" Jackson stood up, the old cargo trousers feeling more comfortable than the dress uniform ever would. "Yeah," he said, looking at the empty cup. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." The next morning, the news of the siphon's success began to spread through the bastion. It wasn't an official report. It was a whisper in the static, a ripple of hope that bypassed the council's censorship. People in the lower sectors, the ones who bore the brunt of the atmospheric feedback during bombardments, started to talk about the man from the frontier who moved stations and saved lives without firing a shot. The siphon was no longer just a project. It was a legend in the making. And Jackson Thorne, the man who had arrived in grease-stained boots, was now the center of it all. He spent the rest of the day in the lab, refining the algorithms and preparing for the next phase. He didn't see Alara, but he felt her presence in the data, a steady violet pulse that kept him grounded. They were two strategists at the edge of a new doctrine, and the world was finally starting to listen to their song. But as the suns of Bastion Null began to rise, casting a harsh metallic light over the Faujai, Jackson knew that the peace wouldn't last. The Karth were coming, and Krell was waiting for a reason to tear it all down. He looked at his hands, steady and strong. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a prince. He was just a man who knew how to fix things. And right now, the most broken thing in the galaxy was the way they fought for it. "I'm going to need a bigger lens," he muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The battle for Bastion Null was coming, but for the first time in 17 missions, Jackson Thorne wasn't planning an extraction. He was planning a stand. And this time, 0 casualties wasn't just a goal, it was an absolute. The harmonic static hummed, a low, constant reminder of the planet's power. But beneath it, Jackson could hear something else, a heartbeat, a rhythm of life that refused to be silenced by iron. It was the sound of a world that was finally starting to breathe, and he was the one who had given it the oxygen. "Commander," a voice called out from the console, "the next simulation is ready." Jackson turned, a determined look in his eyes. "Let's get to work," he said. "We've got a planet to save, and I'm not finished with this coffee yet." The lab came to life, a symphony of light and sound that filled the sub-basement with the energy of 1,000 stars. Jackson moved through the holographic displays, his fingers weaving a pattern of mercy into the geometry of war. He was no longer just an engineer. He was the architect of a new hope. And as the simulation began, the iris of Bastion Null opened, ready to catch the energy of the void and turn it into the light of a new dawn. The story of the man who married the regent and saved the Faujai was only just beginning. But as the first energy pulses hit the shield, shifting from red to gold, it was clear that the rules of the game had changed. The siphon was open, and the flow was just beginning. Jackson Thorne looked at the display, a faint, confident smile on his face. 0 casualties, he whispered. 17 times before. Let's make it 18. The simulation held. The station remained green. And in the silence of the archive, the record of Jackson Thorne began to glow with a light that would eventually outshine even the brightest stars of the frontier. The man who refused to kill was now the man who could not be defeated. And the regent who saw the truth in a footnote was finally no longer alone in the dark. The future was no longer a wall, it was a lens, and through it, they could see everything. The chapter concluded as the lab lights dimmed, leaving Jackson in the quiet glow of the siphon. He was tired, he was covered in grease, and his feet ached. But as he looked at the data, he knew that for the first time in his life, he had fixed something that would never stay broken. He had fixed the heart of the Faujai. And that was a victory worth every drop of coffee in the sector. As the morning light hit the metallic continents of Bastion Null, the planet didn't just vibrate with static, it resonated with a new frequency, the frequency of survival, the frequency of hope, the frequency of a man and a woman who had found a way to win without losing themselves in the process. The siphon was alive, and so were they. The next few days would be a whirlwind of ceremony and politics. But for now, in the quiet of the morning, Jackson Thorne allowed himself a single moment of peace. He had done his job. He had saved the people. And he had found a reason to stay. 0 casualties, he thought again, closing his eyes. 18. The lift ascended, carrying him toward the surface and the unknown challenges that awaited. But as he stepped out into the air of the Grand Bastion, he knew he was ready. He had his wrench, he had his doctrine, and he had the Regent. The universe was still mostly made of grease and leaking hydraulics. But in the center of it all, there was a lens of iridescent gold, catching the light and refusing to let it go. And that was enough for him. The chapter of the frontier was over. The chapter of the HFY had begun. And Jackson Thorne was no longer a ghost in the static. He was the voice that the world had been waiting to hear. The static hummed, but for once, it didn't feel like a headache. It felt like music. And Jackson Thorne, the man with the grease on his hands, was the one who was finally learning how to play. The morning suns of Bastion Null rose higher, illuminating the path ahead. It was a path paved with iron and silence. But for Jackson and Alara, it was the road home. And they walked it together, one step at a time, toward a future that was finally within their reach. 0 casualties, 18 missions. One planet, one heart. The siphon was complete. The union was forged. And the story of Bastion Null was about to be rewritten in the light of a new dawn. Jackson Thorne looked back at the lab one last time before the doors closed. He saw the shimmering globe of the siphon, a golden promise in the dark. "We did it," he whispered, and the silence of the HFY whispered back in a language that only they could understand. A language of hope, a language of peace, a language of mercy. The siphon had begun, and the world would never be the same. The transition from the lab to the upper levels was a blur of metallic surfaces and shifting lights. Jackson found himself in a quiet corridor leading to the Regent's private study. He hadn't been invited, but his new clearance allowed him access, and he felt a sudden, urgent need to see her. Not as a regent, but as the partner who had stood by him in the heat of the resonators. He found her standing by a tall window, looking out at the city as it woke up. She had removed her flight suit and was back in a simple, flowing gown of deep violet. Her long ears were relaxed, their tips glowing faintly in the morning light. "Commander," she said without turning, "I thought you were sleeping." "I was," Jackson said, leaning against the doorframe. "But then I realized I forgot to thank you." "For what?" "For seeing the footnotes," he said softly. "Most people just see the red ink. You saw the reason behind it." Alara turned, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the siphon. "I didn't just see the reason, Jackson. I saw the future, and I saw the only man who could build it." They stood there for a long moment, the distance between them filled with the unspoken resonance of their shared victory. The static was quiet now, a soft background hum that felt like the breath of a sleeping giant. "We have a long way to go," Jackson said. "Krell isn't going to make this easy." "I know," she replied, "but for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the static." Jackson walked over to her, standing by her side at the window. He looked out at the world they were trying to save, a world of iron and light and hidden hearts. "Me neither," he said. As the suns climbed higher, casting away the last of the blue shadows, Jackson Thorne and Alara Thaloris stood together at the edge of their new world. They were no longer just a legend in the making. They were the architects of a new reality. And as they watched the city come to life, they knew that the siphon was more than just a shield. It was a bridge between the past and the future, between the frontier and the HFY, and between two souls who had finally found their way home. The day had begun, and the song of Bastion Null was finally beginning to change. 0 casualties, 18 missions, and counting. The story of the siphon was just beginning. And the universe was finally starting to listen. The lower sectors of Bastion Null were a place where the grandeur of the Thaloris line dissolved into the grit of the machine. Down here, in the region known as the Forge Deep, the air was a thick soup of recycled carbon, heavy with the smell of scorched copper and the sweat of 10,000 laborers. The harmonic static was not a whisper here. It was a rhythmic thumping, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the floor plates and into the soles of Jackson's boots. Jackson stood on a catwalk overlooking a primary energy conduit, that pulsed with a dangerous, unstable violet light. He had been on the planet for only 6 days, but the transition from frontier scavenger to commander of the Siphon had already begun to wear on his nerves. He was still wearing his old cargo trousers, the pockets bulging with specialized wrenches and microscanners, a stark contrast to the silver-armored guards who followed him like silent shadows. "Commander, we have a breach in the coolant manifold in Sector 12, a voice crackled over his comms. It was Kale, the young technician Jackson had brought with him from the mining moon. Jackson had insisted on his own team, much to the annoyance of High Admiral Krell. Sector 12? Jackson adjusted the headset, his eyes scanning a flickering data slate. That's a residential block. If that manifold goes, we're looking at an atmospheric bleed. How bad is the surge? It's redlining, Kale replied, his voice tight with a fear that hadn't been filtered out by the static. The High Council wants to seal the sector. They're calling it a standard containment protocol. Standard containment, Jackson muttered, his jaw tightening. On Bastion Null, that meant locking the doors and letting the people inside suffocate to save the integrity of the power grid. It was the iron logic of the HFY. The wall must stand, even if it stands over a graveyard. Tell the local guards to stand down, Jackson ordered, already moving toward the grav lift. I'm heading down there. And Kale, tell the Regent we're about to have our first real-world test of the siphon. He didn't wait for a reply. He knew the risks. Sector 12 was home to 5,000 service workers, the people who kept the lithic resonators turning. If he failed, Krell would have all the ammunition he needed to end the Siphon Initiative and send Jackson to a labor colony for the rest of his natural life. When the lift doors opened at the bottom of the Forge Deep, the heat hit him like a physical blow. The air was shimmering with thermal distortion. A crowd of frantic workers was gathered at the heavy blast doors of the manifold chamber, their faces pale under the flickering emergency lights. A squad of HFY guards stood with their rifles crossed, blocking the exit. "Open the damn doors," one of the workers screamed, his voice raw. "My daughter is in there. The air is turning to poison." "Regulation 42, the guard captain said, his voice a cold, mechanical drone. "In the event of a manifold surge, the sector must remain sealed until the pressure stabilizes. No exceptions." Jackson pushed through the crowd, his presence causing a ripple of confused murmurs. The guards straightened as they saw the commander's insignia on his shoulder, though their rifles stayed down. "Captain, open those doors," Jackson said, his voice low and dangerous. "Commander Thorne," the captain replied, his long ears twitching in the heat. "Admiral Krell has personally authorized the seal. The grid is at 85% capacity. If we vent the pressure into the common areas, we risk a total blackout in the Grand Bastion." "I don't give a damn about the Grand Bastion's lights," Jackson snapped. "I'm the commander of the Siphon, and I'm telling you that we don't seal people inside burning rooms. Now move aside before I find a wrench big enough to move you myself." The captain hesitated. He looked at the frantic faces of the workers, then at the hard, grease-stained man standing in front of him. There was something in Jackson's eyes that didn't belong on Bastion Null, a raw, stubborn humanity that refused to compute with the standing orders. The captain stepped aside. Jackson didn't wait for a second invitation. He grabbed a thermal mask from a nearby rack and slammed the override button on the blast doors. A wave of superheated gas hissed outward, pushing the crowd back. Jackson dove into the chamber, the world disappearing into a haze of violet light and screaming alarms. Inside, the manifold was a nightmare of twisted pipes and arcing electricity. The siphon sensors he had installed days ago were blinking frantically, trying to redirect the surge, but the hardware was failing under the pressure. Through the haze, Jackson saw a group of workers huddling in a corner, their hands over their mouths as they struggled to breathe. "Get to the exit," Jackson shouted, his voice muffled by the mask. "Move!" He scrambled toward the primary valve, his fingers burning as they touched the heated metal. The siphon wasn't just a shield in orbit, it was a way of thinking. He didn't try to shut the valve. The pressure was too high. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a series of harmonic resonators, the small, palm-sized devices he had designed in the lab. He slapped them onto the manifold pipes in a specific sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4. The violet light began to pulse in time with the resonators. Jackson closed his eyes, visualizing the flow of energy. He wasn't fighting the surge. He was inviting it. He opened the secondary bypass, a move that would have been suicide under the old doctrine. Instead of exploding, the energy began to flow into the siphon subgrid. The violet glow shifted to a soft, iridescent gold. The screaming of the pipes died down to a low melodic hum. The air in the chamber cooled almost instantly as the thermal energy was converted into a stored charge. Jackson slumped against the manifold, his lungs burning, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He watched as the last of the workers scrambled out of the chamber, supported by the guards who had finally decided to help. "Commander?" He looked up to see Alara standing at the doorway. She wasn't wearing her royal gown. She was in a simple technician's coat, her face smudged with soot. Her ears were angled sharply forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "The grid is stable," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "In fact, we've gained 3 megawatts of stored power. You turned a disaster into a battery." "I turned a graveyard back into a workshop," Jackson said, pulling off his mask. He looked at the workers who were being reunited with their families. "That's the lesson, Alara. The wall only matters if there's someone left to stand behind it." The moment of victory was short-lived. A shadow fell over the doorway as High Admiral Krell and Counselor Vane arrived, followed by a phalanx of senior officers. Krell's face was a mask of cold fury. "You violated a direct containment order, Thorn," Krell barked, his voice echoing in the cooling chamber. "You risked the entire planetary grid for a handful of laborers." "I saved 5,000 lives and gave you free power, Admiral," Jackson replied, standing his ground. "If that's a violation, then your regulations are as broken as that manifold." Counselor Vane stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he studied the golden glow of the resonators. "This is not about the people, Commander. This is about control. You have introduced a variable into our world that we cannot predict. The siphon it is a softening of our resolve. If resolve means letting children suffocate to keep your offices bright, then yeah, I'm soft," Jackson said. "And I'm going to stay that way." Krell turned to Alara, his ears flattened in a gesture of ultimate defiance. "Your Highness, this man is a danger to the Faugi. He prioritizes individual lives over the collective security of Bastion Null. I am formally requesting his removal from the Siphon Initiative." Alara stepped forward, her silhouette small but unyielding against the massive machinery of the Forge Deep. "The request is denied, Admiral. Commander Thorn has demonstrated that the siphon is more than a theory. It is a reality that has already saved 5,000 of our citizens. From this day forward, the containment protocols are abolished. We will adapt, or we will fail, but we will not kill our own to survive." Krell stared at her for a long moment, a dark, dangerous energy simmering in his gaze. "You are making a mistake, Regent. A Faugi that learns to bend is a Faugi that is ready to break." "We'll see," Alara said. As the officers marched away, Jackson looked at Alara. Her face was pale, and he realized the cost of the stand she had just taken. She had openly defied the military establishment of her world for a man she barely knew, and a doctrine that was still in its infancy. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I am unsettled," she admitted, her ears drooping slightly. "Krell is right about one thing, Jackson. The people are starting to talk. They are starting to hope. And hope is a very dangerous thing on a world built on fear." "Then let's give them something to hope for," Jackson said, offering her a hand. "Come on. I think I know how to fix the rest of the manifold, and I'm going to need someone who can see the data better than I can." As they walked back toward the lift, Jackson didn't notice the small, red blinking light on one of the secondary conduits. It wasn't a surge and it wasn't a failure. It was a signal. Somewhere deep in the static of Bastion Null, something was listening, and it was starting to wake up. The revelation came at 3 o'clock in the morning, during the quietest part of the night cycle, when the harmonic static of the planet was at its most rhythmic and hypnotic. Jackson and Alara were in the central archive, surrounded by the shimmering ghosts of 10,000 data streams. They had been working for 12 hours straight, trying to integrate the data from the Forge Deep incident into the planetary shield model. Jackson was leaning over a holographic projection of the star system, his eyes bleary from lack of sleep. He had been tracking a series of faint gravitational anomalies on the edge of the rimward territories, thinking they were just debris from the atmospheric collapse of Urios. But the siphon sensors, now tuned to the delicate frequencies of the planet's new heartbeat, were seeing something else. "Ilara, look at this," Jackson said, his voice a low whisper. She moved to his side, her ears angling toward the projection. "What is it?" "I thought these were just echoes in the static. Ghost signatures from the old radar arrays. But when I run them through the siphon's filter, they don't disappear. They get clearer." He adjusted the frequency of the projection. The star map shifted, the violet haze of the interference fading to a sharp, cold blue. In the empty space between Bastion Null and the nearest nebula, a fleet began to emerge. It wasn't a dominion of Karth fleet. These ships were older, their designs jagged and unfamiliar, built from a dark, non-reflective material that seemed to swallow the light. They weren't moving. They were drifting, perfectly synchronized, like a school of sleeping predators. "What are they?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jackson said, "but they've been there for a long time. They're ghosting our sensors by vibrating at the exact same frequency as the harmonic static. Our old defense grid was literally designed to ignore them. It thought they were part of the planet's own noise. But the siphon changed the noise," Ilara realized, her face turning pale. "When we tilted the frequency in the lab, when you stabilized the manifold." "We changed the song," Jackson finished, "and they're starting to wake up to the new music." He tapped a command on the console, trying to get a closer look at the lead ship. The image was grainy, distorted by the vast distance, but he could see a series of glowing runes etched into the hull. Runes that matched the ancient carvings in the foundation of the lithic resonators. "These aren't invaders," Jackson said, a cold realization dawning on him. "These are the founders, or at least their machines. They didn't build this foul Jai to protect us from the Karth. They built it as a cage, and we're the ones inside." The chamber doors hissed open, but it wasn't a servant or a technician. It was Admiral Krell, his armor clanking in the silence. He was alone, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "So you found them?" Krell said, his voice devoid of its usual bark. "I thought the siphon might reveal the truth sooner or later." "You knew?" Ilara turned to him, her ears flat against her head in a gesture of pure outrage. "You knew there was a fleet of ancient machines sitting on our doorstep, and you said nothing?" "The knowledge of the Ghost Fleet is the most guarded secret of the High Command," Krell said, stepping into the light of the projection. "For 300 years, we have maintained the harmonic static to keep them asleep. Every wall we build, every shield we reinforce, is not for the Karth. It is to ensure that the noise of our civilization never reaches a frequency that would trigger their return." "And you thought the best way to handle a loaded gun was to pretend it wasn't there?" Jackson asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You kept 5 generations of people in a state of perpetual fear and static burn just to keep some old rust buckets from waking up?" "It has worked for 3 centuries, Commander," Krell snapped, his eyes flashing. "Until you arrived with your lenses and your mercy, you have altered the heartbeat of the planet. You have sent a signal that says the cage is open." Ilara looked at the projection, at the thousands of dark ships that were now beginning to show signs of internal power. "How long do we have?" "The anomalies are increasing," Krell said. "The lead ship has already begun its approach. It will reach our outer orbit in 72 hours. When it does, it will attempt to re-establish the original harmonic protocol." "Which means what?" Jackson asked. "Which means it will shut down everything that doesn't match its frequency," Krell said. "Our power grid, our life support, our ships. It will reset Bastion Null to a state of silent, armored hibernation, and every living soul on this planet will be extinguished in the process." Jackson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, the ultimate extraction mission. But this time he wasn't pulling people off a moon. He was trying to stop a god machine from hitting the reset button on 5 billion people. "Can we fight them?" Ilara asked. "With what?" Krell asked, gesturing to the projection. "Our weapons are designed for the Karth. They rely on the very frequencies these machines control. If we fire a plasma cannon at them, they'll just absorb the energy and use it to speed up the reset." The Admiral looked at Jackson, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something like respect, or perhaps desperation, in his eyes. This is why I opposed you, Thorn. Not because I am a monster who likes to see people suffer, but because I knew that any change, any progress, would bring us to this moment. You wanted to give them hope. Now that hope is what will kill them. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, looking out at the shimmering blue lights of the city. He could see the people below, the workers he had saved, the families who were finally starting to breathe without fear. He thought about the zero-casualty record he had spent his life protecting. "We're not going to fight them with weapons," Jackson said, turning back to face the Admiral. Krell scoffed. "Then how? With more coffee and footnotes?" "No," Jackson said, his voice steady. "We're going to use the siphon. If these machines are looking for a specific frequency, then we give it to them. But we don't give them the silence of the cage. We give them the music of the people." Ilara looked at him, her ears twitching as she caught his meaning. "You want to broadcast the harmonic resonance of the entire population? Every heart, every voice, every machine that isn't built for war," Jackson said. "We use the lithic resonators to amplify the collective life sign of Bastion Null. We drown out the reset signal with the sound of a civilization that refuses to go back to sleep." "It's impossible," Krell said. "The energy required to broadcast on that scale would burn out the resonators in minutes." "Not if we use the stored energy from the siphon," Jackson countered. "Not if we use the power we've been collecting from the Karth raids and the manifold surges. We turn the whole planet into a lens. We don't push back against the founders. We invite them to listen." Krell looked from Jackson to Ilara, his brow furrowed in thought. "It is a gamble with 5 billion lives. If you are wrong, there will be no retreat, no extraction." "I've never lost a person on a mission yet, Admiral," Jackson said. "I don't plan on starting with this one." Ilara stepped forward, her hand resting on the console. "Admiral, you have spent 300 years hiding in the dark, waiting for the end. It is time to see if we can live in the light. Prepare the fleet for a defensive perimeter, but do not fire unless I give the order." Krell stood at attention, his long ears notched and scarred, his expression unreadable. "As you command, Regent, but God help us all if the commander's music is out of tune." As the Admiral left the chamber, silence returned, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive static of before. It was a tense, expectant quiet. Jackson looked at Ilara, and for a moment, the weight of the coming battle felt overwhelming. "You really think this will work?" she asked softly. "I think that for 300 years this planet has been screaming in a room with no windows," Jackson said. "I think it's time we open the door and let everyone hear us." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "We're going to need more resonators," Jackson said, a faint, determined smile touching his lips. "And a lot more coffee." Ilara laughed, a sound that was pure and clear, untainted by the static of the Faujai. "I'll see to the coffee. You see to the music." As the night cycle continued, the two of them began to work, their silhouettes moving among the glowing data ghosts. Above them, the stars remained indifferent, and the ghost fleet continued its silent, predatory approach. But on the surface of Bastion Null, the heartbeat was changing. It was no longer a mechanical thud. It was a complex, beautiful resonance, the sound of a world that was finally, truly waking up. The cost of the old way had been 300 years of fear. The cost of the new way was yet to be determined. But as Jackson Thorne calibrated the first of the planetary-scale resonators, he knew that the lesson of the frontier was the only one that mattered now. You don't save a world by building a wall. You save it by making sure it's worth saving. He thought about the technician Kale, the guard captain in the Forge Deep, and the little girl whose father had almost been sealed behind a blast door. He thought about the 17 missions where he had refused to leave anyone behind. Mission 18, he whispered to himself. Objective, 5 billion people. Casualty target, 0. The static hummed, but for the first time Jackson Thorne didn't try to filter it out. He listened to the cracks in the iron, and he heard the beginning of a song. The turning point had arrived. The shadows of the founders were falling over Bastion Null, and the era of silence was coming to an end. Whether it ended in fire or in a new frequency, Jackson knew one thing for certain. They would meet it together, with their eyes open and their voices loud enough to wake the stars. The lab lights flickered as the power surged through the primary processors. Jackson leaned over the console, his fingers moving with a speed that defied exhaustion. He had 72 hours to rewire a planet. He had 72 hours to turn a cage into a choir. And as the first note of the new frequency resonated through the lithic resonators, deep in the heart of the HFY, Jackson Thorne knew that he had finally found the mission he was born to complete. The ghosts were coming, but Bastion Knoll was no longer afraid of the dark. Jackson looked at Alara, who was monitoring the planetary life signs. She caught his gaze and nodded, her ears angled forward in a gesture of perfect alignment. The bond between them, forged in the heat of a failing reactor and the cold light of a secret history, was now the strongest thing on the planet. "Let's make some noise, Alara," Jackson said. "I believe we already are, Commander," she replied. The chapter ended with the sound of the resonators rising in pitch, a golden frequency that began to ripple outward through the metallic continents, challenging the ancient silence of the void and setting the stage for a confrontation that would decide the fate of 5 billion souls. The geometry of mercy was no longer a theory. It was a broadcast, and the universe was finally about to hear the answer. Outside, the first of the dark ships crossed the orbital threshold, its sensors scanning for the familiar hum of the cage. It found instead a vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful resonance that it did not recognize. It paused, its ancient logic circuits stuttering as it encountered a variable it had never been programmed to handle. A world that had forgotten how to be afraid. The siphon was open, the music was playing, and the ghosts in the machine were about to meet the people of the HFY. Jackson Thorne took a sip of his cold coffee and smiled. Mission 18 was officially underway, and he wasn't planning on losing a single soul. The static was dead. Long live the song. The weight of the coming hours felt like a physical pressure, but Jackson's hands were steady. He had spent his life in the grease and the dirt, fixing the things that the brass said couldn't be fixed. And as he looked at the data, he knew that this was just another machine. A big, ancient, terrifying machine, but a machine nonetheless. And any machine could be reasoned with if you spoke its language. The language of survival. The language of light. He looked at the display one last time before the next phase of the integration began. The casualty count remained at 0. "Let's keep it that way," he whispered. The lift began to descend, carrying him back down to the forge deep, where the real work would be done. He had a planet to rewire, a fleet to talk to, and a future to build. And he wasn't going to stop until every person on Bastion Knoll could hear the music for themselves. The turning point was here, and Jackson Thorne was ready to lead the dance. The sky above Bastion Knoll did not just darken, it curdled. The first of the Warden vessels, a jagged mountain of non-reflective obsidian 4 kilometers long, slipped through the orbital defense ring as if the steel and plasma batteries were nothing more than cobwebs. It didn't fire. It didn't broadcast threats. It simply existed, a silent, predatory weight that seemed to pull the very air out of the atmosphere. Jackson Thorne stood on the command terrace of the Grand Bastion, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes. The harmonic static, once a steady throb, had become a jagged, screaming whine that made his vision blur. "They're not even trying to bypass the grid," Jackson muttered, his voice strained. "They're just overwriting it, like a bad line of code being deleted by the system." Beside him, Alara was a statue of regal defiance. Her long ears were swept back, trembling with the sheer intensity of the data flooding her neural link. "The monolith," she whispered. "The archive spoke of the primary warden. It isn't a ship, Jackson. It's a localized reset point. If it reaches the atmospheric ceiling, it will emit a pulse that aligns every molecule on this planet to the Founder's original silence." "Yeah, well, I've always been a fan of making a little noise," Jackson said, trying to inject some of his usual grit into the situation, though his stomach felt like it was full of cold lead. "Commander! Regent!" High Admiral Krell stormed onto the terrace, his armor scorched from a localized energy surge in the lower decks. Behind him, a dozen tactical officers moved with the frantic energy of men who knew they were staring at their own graves. "The gavel is ready!" Krell barked, his eyes fixed on the obsidian mountain in the sky. 300,000 megawatts of focused planetary energy. We fire now, or we don't fire at all. If we can crack that hull before it reaches the ceiling, we might have a chance. You fire the gavel, and you're just ringing the dinner bell. Jackson snapped, turning to face the Admiral. That thing feeds on energy, Admiral. You hit it with the gavel, and it'll use that charge to reset the entire northern hemisphere in 30 seconds. It's foobar. We can't fight a god machine with a bigger hammer. Then what, Thorne? Krell stepped into Jackson's space, the scent of ozone and old blood clinging to him. We sit here and wait for the lights to go out? I've got 4 billion people looking at the sky, waiting for a savior. I won't have them die without a single shot fired. Then don't let them die, Jackson said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Admiral, your doctrine says victory is the destruction of the enemy. My doctrine says victory is the survival of the people. Right now, those two things are opposites. If you fire, you kill everyone. If we use the siphon, we might, just might, talk our way out of this. Talk to a machine? Krell scoffed. You've spent too much time in the grease, gearhead. It's a tool. It has a function. It doesn't have ears. It has sensors, Alara interjected, stepping between the two men. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of her entire bloodline. It is searching for the frequency of a cage. If we show it the frequency of a home, it will have to reevaluate its primary directive. Logic, Admiral. Even a god machine follows logic. A massive shudder rocked the bastion. The sky turned a sickening shade of violet as the monolith began its descent. In the distance, the city lights flickered and died. The harmonic static reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. It was a vacuum of sound that felt like it was sucking the soul out of the world. Power failure in sectors 3 through 9, a voice crackled over the comms. Life support is failing in the nurseries. The heat sinks are redlining. Jackson checked his data slate. His eyes widened. It's starting. The monolith is pulling the charge directly out of our civilian grid to power its pulse. Krell, if you fire the gavel now, you're pulling the last of the air out of those nurseries to do it. Krell hesitated. He looked at the sky, then at the tactical display showing 5,000 red blinking lights, each one a sector losing oxygen. The gavel requires 80% of the planetary reserve, the Admiral whispered. If I fire, the hospitals go dark. The shelters fail. 0 casualties, Admiral, Jackson said, stepping closer. That's been my record for 17 missions. Don't make me break it on the 18th. Give me the power. Let me push everything we have into the siphon. Every scrap of energy, every heartbeat, every voice. We don't fight the monolith. We drown it in humanity. Ilara reached out, her hand finding Jackson's. Her touch was the only thing that felt real in the terrifying silence. Trust him, Admiral. He knows how to fix things that are broken. And right now, the most broken thing is our fear. Krell looked at the obsidian mountain, then at the 2 outliers standing before him. He was a man of the old world, a man who believed in iron and fire. But as the screams of the dying static echoed in his ears, he saw the truth in Jackson's stubborn, grease-stained eyes. Transfer the gavel's reserves to the siphon, Krell commanded, his voice cracking with the weight of the decision. God help us, Thorne. If you miss the beat, we're all just echoes in the dark. Jackson didn't wait. He sprinted toward the siphon lab, his boots pounding against the stone. Kyle, Alara, get to the resonators. We need to sync the planetary heartbeat to the civilian broadcast. I want the sound of every mother's lullaby, every worker's song, every kid's laugh pushed into the primary frequency. Now! The climax was no longer a battle of cannons. It was a battle of resonance. As Jackson dove into the interface, the world around him began to dissolve into a sea of golden data. He wasn't looking at tactical maps anymore. He was looking at lives. 5 billion points of light, each one a melody in a symphony that had been silenced for 300 years. He gripped the manual overrides, the silver dust on his hands glowing in the dark. Come on, you big bucket of bolts, he whispered, looking up through the holographic ceiling at the monolith. Listen to us. We're not a cage. We're alive. The siphon flared. A beam of iridescent gold energy erupted from the lithic resonators, piercing the violet sky. It didn't strike the monolith. It enveloped it. It was a broadcast of pure, unadulterated life, the sound of a world that refused to be forgotten. The monolith paused. Its obsidian hull shimmered, the ancient runes beginning to pulse with a confused, flickering light. The transformation had begun, but the cost was already mounting. "Jackson!" Ilara's voice screamed through his neural link. "The power draw is too much. The resonators are melting. We're losing Sector 12 again." Mom. Jackson looked at the monitor. He had a choice. He could keep the power focused on the broadcast to ensure the monolith stayed paused, or he could divert a portion of it to save the 5,000 workers in Sector 12. If he diverted the power, the broadcast might weaken. The monolith might finish the reset. But if he didn't, 5,000 people would be the first casualties of his career. "Jackson, don't!" Krell's voice crackled. "Stay the course. The planet for a sector. It's the only way." Jackson's hands hovered over the controls. He thought about the little girl in the manifold chamber. He thought about the technician who had helped him fix the landing strut. He thought about the 17 missions where he had never left a soul behind. "I don't do math with lives, Admiral," Jackson said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm. He reached out and slammed the override. "Diverting power to Sector 12, he announced. "Kale, tighten the frequency. We're going to have to make the same noise with half the voice." The golden beam flickered. The monolith's runes turned a sharp, angry purple. The reset pulse began to build, a low hum that vibrated the very stones of the HFY. "We're not going to make it," Krell whispered from the terrace. But then, something happened that no one had predicted. The people of Sector 12, seeing the power return to their lights and their life support, didn't just sit in the dark. They began to sing. A low, rhythmic chant that had been passed down through generations of laborers in the forge deep. It was a song of endurance, of heat and iron and survival. The siphon, tuned to the civilian frequency, caught the vibration. It wasn't just Jackson's broadcast anymore. It was the planet itself responding. The song of the forge deep joined the lullabies of the northern sectors. The resonance grew, not from a machine's power, but from the will of the people who had been saved. The golden beam intensified, brighter and purer than before. The monolith's reset pulse faltered. The obsidian hull began to crack, showing a core of soft white light. The ancient machine wasn't being destroyed. It was being recalibrated. It was finding a new frequency. Jackson slumped against the console, his vision fading to black as the sheer weight of the connection overwhelmed him. But as he fell, he heard one last thing through the static. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a reset. It was a heartbeat, clear, steady, and loud enough to wake the universe. 0 casualties, he thought, a faint smile touching his lips. 18. The sky above Bastion Knoll began to clear, the violet haze replaced by the first true dawn the planet had seen in 3 centuries. But as the light returned, Jackson Thorne drifted into the dark, his heart tied to a world that was finally, truly learning how to breathe. Consciousness returned to Jackson in fragments, the smell of sterile ozone, the steady, rhythmic beep of a medical monitor, the weight of a warm hand in his. He opened his eyes and immediately winced. The light was too bright. It wasn't the artificial, filtered glow of the HFY. It was the raw, unfiltered brilliance of a sun that was no longer obscured by the harmonic static. "Easy, gearhead," a voice said. Jackson turned his head slowly. Ilara was sitting beside his bed, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, but her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her long ears were relaxed, twitching slightly at the sound of a bird chirping somewhere outside the infirmary window. "Did we?" Jackson's voice was a dry rasp. 0 casualties, Ilara whispered, leaning forward to brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Every sector held. The monolith. It didn't reset us, Jackson. It synchronized with us. It's still in orbit, but it's dormant. A sentinel, not a cage." Jackson exhaled, the tension that had been coiled in his chest for days finally beginning to unwind. "Sector 12? They're calling it the miracle of the forge," she said, a soft laugh escaping her. The workers refused to leave their posts. They said if the commander could move a station for them, they could sing a song for him. "You've become quite the celebrity, Jackson." Krell is already complaining that he can't get a salute out of anyone without them asking if you've had your coffee yet. Jackson tried to sit up, but his body felt like it had been through a trash compactor. Krell, he's not going to have me court-martialed for stealing his gavel power? He tried, a new voice rumbled. Admiral Krell stepped into the room. He looked older, his face etched with the lines of a man who had seen his entire worldview shattered in a single night. He wasn't wearing his medals. He wasn't even wearing his primary armor. He just looked like a soldier who had finally come home from a very long war. I tried, Krell repeated, standing at the foot of the bed, but the regent pointed out that court-martialing the man who saved the planet might cause a bit of a morale issue. And besides, he paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. I heard the song, Thorn. I was on the terrace when the grid failed. I saw the power go to the nurseries instead of the guns. I thought you were a fool. I thought you were killing us all for a sentiment. And? Jackson asked. Krell looked up, his eyes clear and honest. I was wrong. For 300 years, we thought the only way to survive was to be harder than the enemy. We thought mercy was a luxury we couldn't afford. But last night, mercy was the only thing that worked. The people didn't stand because we ordered them to. They stood because they knew someone was standing for them. He reached out and placed a hand on the railing of Jackson's bed. It was a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any promotion. The siphon is being integrated into the core architecture of the Fauji. We're dismantling the gavel. We don't need a hammer if we have a voice. What about the Karth? Jackson asked. They're still out there. They're not going to be moved by a lullaby. Let them come, Krell said, a faint, dangerous smile returning to his face. We'll show them the siphon. We'll show them a world that can catch their fire and turn it into light. But for now, Commander, take your rest. You've earned it. As Krell left, the room fell into a comfortable silence. Jackson looked at Alara, who was still holding his hand. The transformation was visible everywhere, in the clear sky outside, in the lack of static in the air, and in the way the people of Bastion Null were finally beginning to talk to one another without the distorted bark of the interference. The council is still meeting, Alara said softly. They're worried about the political implications of a planet that doesn't fear its rulers. They're worried about what happens when the iron bandages are finally removed. They should be worried, Jackson said, his fingers tightening around hers. Because once people learn how to breathe, they don't usually like being choked again. We've got a lot of work to do, Alara. We've got to build schools where the bunkers used to be. We've got to turn the lithic resonators into actual communication hubs. And the marriage? She asked, her eyes searching his. The council is calling it a strategic necessity now, to bind the new doctrine to the old bloodline. Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, without the pressure of a dying world or a god machine hanging over them. He saw the woman who had risked everything for a footnote in a report. He saw the partner who had stood in the heat of the Forge Deep and the silence of the archive. I don't do things because they're a strategic necessity, Jackson said. I do them because they're right. And marrying you, that's the most right thing I've ever done. Lara's ears angled forward, glowing with a soft, violet light. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. Then it's settled. No more politics, no more data points. Just us. And coffee, Jackson added. Better coffee in every sector. She laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet room. In every sector, Jackson. I promise. As the days passed, the healing of Bastion Null began in earnest. It was a painful process, like a limb waking up after being numb for too long. There were riots in some sectors as the old guard struggled to adapt to the lack of static. There were food shortages as the logistics of a non-military economy were hammered out. But through it all, the theme of the siphon held, the value of the individual, the refusal to accept acceptable losses. Jackson was often seen in the lower sectors, his commander's tunic discarded for his old grease-stained flight suit. He was helping rebuild the manifolds, teaching the workers how to maintain the resonators, and sitting in the common rooms, listening to the stories of the people he had saved. One afternoon, he was in Sector 12, standing by the same manifold that had almost cost him his life. The little girl he had saved, a shy child with the same long ears as Alara, approached him with a small, crumpled drawing. It was a picture of a golden beam of light, with thousands of tiny stick figures holding hands beneath it. "Is that us?" Jackson asked, crouching down to her level. "The song," she whispered. "My daddy says you caught the song and gave it back to the sky." Jackson took the drawing, his throat tightening. He looked at the manifold, now humming with a peaceful golden light. He thought about the 17 missions that had led him here. The 17 times he had been called a coward or a failure because he wouldn't play the game of war. "Yeah," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. "We gave it back to the sky, and now we're going to make sure it never stops playing." As he walked back toward the lift, Jackson felt a sense of peace he had never known. He was no longer a ghost in the static. He was part of the harmony. The humanistic lesson wasn't just a theory anymore. It was the foundation of a new world. A world where a fortress wasn't measured by its walls, but by the safety of the people inside them. Where a leader wasn't someone who commanded from a throne, but someone who stood in the grease with the people and refused to let them go. He reached the Grand Bastion just as the suns were beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet that matched the colors of the siphon. Ilara was waiting for him on the terrace, 2 cups of steaming coffee in her hands. "The council has agreed to the new charter," she said as he approached. "We are no longer Bastion Null. We are becoming the Resonant, a world defined by its connection, not its isolation." Jackson took the coffee, the warmth of the cup seeping into his tired hands. He looked out at the city, at the lights that were now steady and bright, reflecting the hope of 5 billion souls. "The Resonant," he repeated. "I like it. It sounds like something that doesn't need a manual to understand." "And the first official act of the Resonant?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Jackson took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. A planetary holiday for everyone. No work, no drills, no static. Just music and family. And maybe a little bit of grease work on the side, just for fun. Ilara laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think we can manage that." They stood together on the terrace, watching as the stars began to appear in the clear sky. The monolith was a silent, silver shadow in the distance, a reminder of the past but a promise for the future. The climax of the battle had passed, but the real work was just beginning, the work of staying human in a universe that often demanded otherwise, the work of proving every single day that 0 casualties wasn't just a record, it was a way of life. Jackson Thorne, the man who had come from the grease of the frontier, looked up at the stars and didn't see enemies or territories or strategic points. He saw a neighborhood. "Ready for Mission 19? He whispered to the night air. "Always," Ilara replied. And in the quiet, peaceful air of the world that had learned to sing, the heartbeat of the people continued, steady and strong, a song that would never be silenced again. 0 casualties. Infinite hope. The Resonant had begun. The golden light of the siphon continued to ripple across the atmosphere, a protective lens that didn't just repel the dark, but invited the light. And as Jackson and Ilara stood there, 2 hearts beating in sync with a 5 billion soul symphony, the universe seemed to lean in, listening to the new music of a world that had finally found its voice. The transformation was complete. The lesson was learned. And for the first time in his life, Jackson Thorne didn't have to worry about the next extraction. He was already where he was meant to be. "One more thing," Jackson said, looking at the coffee cup. "Yes? This coffee, it really is better than the frontier stuff. Good call on the marriage, Regent. I told you I don't make mistakes with data, Commander." They laughed together, a sound that rose above the city and joined the harmony of the stars. A final, perfect note in the song of a world that was finally truly free. The first thing Jackson noticed about the world, without the harmonic static, was the sound of the wind. On Bastion Knoll, the air had always felt heavy, a pressurized soup of vibration that muffled the natural world into a distant, metallic hum. Now as he stood on the observation balcony of the medical bay, the wind made a soft, whistling sound through the eaves of the Grand Bastion. It was a lonely sound, but it was honest. It didn't try to hide anything. He was still wearing the medical gown, a thin white slip of a thing that made him feel exposed. His hands, usually stained with the dark, stubborn grease of a dozen different machines, were scrubbed raw and clean. He looked at them, flexing his fingers. They felt light, too light. "You look like a ghost," a voice said. Jackson didn't turn. He knew that voice. It was Kyle, his lead technician from the moon of Ureos. "How is it out there, Kyle? Give me the groundside report. No fluff." Kyle stepped up to the railing, leaning his elbows on the stone. He looked as tired as Jackson felt, his eyes shadowed with the kind of fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. "It's a total cluster, Commander. A beautiful, messy, high-orbit cluster. The power grid is still twitchy. Every time someone turns on a toaster in Sector 7, the primary resonators give a little hiccup. The engineers are going static brain trying to keep the load balanced." "And the people?" Jackson asked. Kyle smiled, and for a moment, the exhaustion seemed to lift. "They're talking. That's the big news. Without the static scrambling their thoughts, everyone is suddenly realizing they have a lot to say to their neighbors. There's no more shouting over the hum. The marketplaces are quiet, but it's a good quiet, like a room full of people who just realize they don't have to scream to be heard." Jackson nodded, looking up at the sky. The Warden monolith was still there, a dark, silent, jagged edge against the stars. It wasn't pulsing anymore. It was just drifting, its ancient purpose overridden by the song of 5 billion souls. "The Wardens didn't leave." "No," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're still out there. But they're not the bosses anymore. The siphon turned the planet into something they don't recognize. We're not a cage they can reset. We're a frequency they can't solve. Admiral Krell is calling it a stalemate, but you and I know better. We won because we stopped playing their game." "We won because we chose to save the Forge Deep workers," Jackson corrected. "If we had followed the math, we would have lost the heartbeat. The machine was looking for a pattern, and the pattern was mercy." Cal looked at him, his expression turning serious. "The boys in the lower sectors, they're already calling you the heart of the resonant. They say you're the only man in 300 years who looked at a casualty report and decided 0 was the only acceptable number. You've changed the doctrine, Jackson. Not just the machines, but the people. They're not waiting for a command anymore. They're waiting for a reason." Jackson felt a pang of unease. He had never wanted to be a hero. He was an engineer. He fixed things that were broken. He didn't want to be the center of a new religion. "I'm just a guy with a wrench, Kale. Don't go turning me into a statue." "Too late, gearhead," Kale chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "The Regent is already planning the union. The Council is calling it the binding of the new frequency. It's going to be the biggest show this planet has ever seen. You'd better get used to the spotlight." As Kale left to return to the labs, Jackson remained on the balcony. He thought about the 17 missions before this one, the 17 extractions where he had been called a coward for choosing to run instead of fight. He had always felt like an outsider, a man who didn't understand the iron logic of the Fauji. But standing here, in the quiet of the new world, he realized that he hadn't been wrong. The universe wasn't a battlefield to be conquered, it was a system to be maintained. And a system was only as healthy as its smallest part. Later that afternoon, High Admiral Krell visited. He wasn't the same man who had stormed the command terrace days ago. His shoulders were slumped, and he moved with a deliberate slowness. He sat in the chair beside Jackson's bed, his long, notched ears twitching at the silence. "It's too quiet," Krell said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I can hear my own blood pumping. I didn't think I'd ever miss the static, but the silence, it makes everything feel fragile." "Fragility isn't weakness, Admiral," Jackson said, sitting up. "A diamond is hard, but you can shatter it with a hammer. A web is fragile, but it catches the wind and holds. We've spent 300 years being diamonds. It's time we learned how to be webs." Krell looked at him, his gaze heavy with a lifetime of war. "The Dominion of Karth has sent a diplomatic scout. They saw the golden flare from 40 light years away. They're confused, Thorn. They don't know if we've developed a new superweapon or if we've finally gone insane. They're asking for an audience with the Regent. And what are you going to tell them?" "I'm going to tell them that the Fauji is closed for renovations," Krell said, a faint, dry smile touching his lips. "I'm going to tell them that if they want to talk, they'll have to learn how to sing. It's a ridiculous thing for a soldier to say, but I've found that I don't much care for the old scripts anymore." He stood up, adjusting his tunic. "The Council is terrified, you know. They're worried that without the fear of the Wardens, the people will realize they don't need a council at all. They're pushing for the Union as a way to stabilize the hierarchy. They want you to be the face of the new order. I'm not a politician, Admiral. Neither was I, Krell said, walking toward the door. But here we are. Just remember, Thorn, the people didn't sing for the regent. They didn't sing for the council. They sang for the man who saved Sector 12 when everyone else was ready to let them burn. Don't let the shiny boots change that. As the days turned into a week, Jackson began to see the immediate aftermath of the climax in the faces of the people he encountered. The nurses in the infirmary moved with a lightness he hadn't seen before. The guards at the doors were less like statues and more like men. Their conversations no longer whispered in the shadows but shared openly. The transformation was happening, and it was painful, like a limb waking up after a long sleep. He spent hours talking to Alara, though talking was a small word for what they did. They shared data streams, their neural links now synchronized to the same peaceful frequency. They planned the restructuring of the planetary resources, moving funds from the Gavel project to the development of civilian trade hubs. They were architects of a new reality, and the bond between them was the cornerstone. One evening, Alara brought him a small battered box. Inside was his old wrench, the one he had tossed to Kyle on the moon of Ureos. Kyle said you might be needing this, she said, her ears angling toward him with a soft, violet glow. He said the Royal shuttles have some leaking hydraulics that only a frontier scavenger can handle. Jackson took the wrench, the weight of it familiar and grounding. He looked at Alara, the woman who had seen the truth in a footnote and had the courage to act on it. I'm not going to be a prince, Alara. I'm not going to sit on a throne and watch the lights. I know, she whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. That's why I chose you. I don't need a prince. I need a man who knows how to keep the air flowing. We're going to build a world where thrones are just chairs, Jackson, and where the only thing we command is the respect we've earned. As the night cycle settled over the Resonant, Jackson Thorne looked at his clean hands and then at the old dented wrench. He understood now that his journey wasn't about the 17 missions he had finished or the one he had just survived. It was about the realization that the right thing wasn't always the loud thing. Sometimes the most courageous act was to stop the machine, even when everyone else was screaming for it to go faster. The aftermath was just the beginning. The real work was in the quiet moments that followed. In the way a father held his daughter in the Forge Deep. In the way an admiral chose to talk instead of fire. In the way a regent chose to love a man from the grease. 0 casualties. That was the goal. But Jackson realized that 0 casualties wasn't just about the people who didn't die. It was about the people who finally learned how to live. He gripped the wrench, his thumb tracing the worn metal. Ready for the Union? Alara asked. As long as there's coffee, Jackson said. They stood together on the balcony, watching the first civilian transport leave the planet, its engines making a soft, melodic hum that joined the symphony of the new world. The Resonant was breathing, and for the first time in his life, Jackson Thorne was breathing with it. The day of the Union was not a day of iron. On a planet that had spent 3 centuries wrapped in bandages of steel, the Grand Bastion had been transformed into a pavilion of light and glass. Thousands of people from every sector, from the high-born scholars of the archive to the soot-stained laborers of the Forge Deep, had gathered in the central plaza. They weren't there because of a royal decree or a military order. They were there because the air was clear, the static was gone, and they wanted to see the man who had given them back their voices. Jackson Thorne stood in the prep chamber, looking at himself in a full-length mirror. He was wearing a formal tunic of deep charcoal and gold, but he had insisted on keeping his old worn engineer's boots. His hair was still a bit unruly, and there was a faint, permanent smudge of oil under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He looked like a man who had been dressed up by someone else, but whose soul still belonged to the machine. You look like a commander, a voice said. Jackson turned. It was Kale, wearing a decent suit for the first time in his life. He looked uncomfortable, tugging at a stiff collar. I feel like a fraud, Kyle. This whole show, it's not me. It doesn't have to be you, Jackson, Kyle said, stepping forward to straighten Jackson's collar. It's for them. They need to see that the man who saved them is real. They need to see that the new doctrine isn't just a line of code on a data slate. It's a person who makes mistakes, gets grease on his hands, and chooses to do the right thing when the lights go out. I just want to go back to the labs, Jackson muttered. I've got 5 more resonators to calibrate in Sector 12. You'll get there, Kyle laughed. But first, you have to walk the walk. The Regent is waiting. The doors to the plaza opened, and a wall of sound hit Jackson. It wasn't the scream of the harmonic static. It was the roar of 500,000 people cheering. It was a physical force, a wave of human energy that made his heart hammer against his ribs. He stepped out onto the long walkway, and the crowd went silent. It was a silence of respect, a silence of recognition. At the far end of the walkway, standing on a dais beneath the shadow of the dormant monolith, was Alara. She was wearing a gown that shimmered with the iridescent gold of the siphon, her long ears angled forward, her eyes fixed on him. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was the heart of the world. Jackson began to walk. Every step felt like a mile. He passed rows of Fao Jai guards who didn't salute with their rifles, but with a simple, open-handed gesture of peace. He passed Admiral Krell, who gave him a sharp, knowing nod. He passed the workers from the Forge Deep, who held up their tools in a silent salute. When he reached the dais, he didn't bow. He took Alara's hand, and for a moment, the entire universe seemed to shrink down to the space between them. I, Regent Alara Thaloris, bind my house and my blood to the new frequency, she said, her voice amplified by the resonators until it reached every corner of the planet. Not as a master of the static, but as a partner in the resonance. And I, Jackson Thorne, he said, his voice steady, bind my hands and my heart to the people of the resonant, to protect the life, not the wall, to choose the survival of the one as the foundation for the security of the many. It wasn't a traditional wedding. It was a declaration of a new social contract, a promise that the era of acceptable losses was over. But Jackson knew that words were cheap. Transformation required action. As the ceremony concluded and the festivities began, Jackson did something that shocked the council. He took off the charcoal tunic, revealing his work shirt beneath. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his old wrench, and walked to the edge of the dais where a primary energy conduit was flickering. A minor glitch that the technicians had been struggling to fix all morning. He didn't call for a team. He didn't issue an order. He knelt down in the dirt, the expensive fabric of his trousers staining as he set to work. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the hero of the monolith, the man who had just married the Regent, began to fix a broken light. He's actually doing it, someone in the crowd whispered. He's one of us, another replied. Within 5 minutes, the light flickered and stayed steady, its golden glow illuminating the faces of the children in the front row. Jackson stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at the council ministers, who were staring at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. The grid doesn't care about your titles, Jackson said, his voice carrying through the quiet plaza. It cares about the connection. If you want a world that works, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty. That's the new doctrine. We all fix the things that are broken. Starting now. He turned back to Alara, who was watching him with a look of pure, unadulterated pride. She stepped down from the dais, her golden gown trailing in the dust, and stood beside him. She reached out and took a small silver microscanner from Kyle, pointing it at the conduit. Let's check the secondary alignment, Commander, she said. The image of the Regent and the Commander working together on a common utility became the defining moment of the new era. It was the humanistic theme embodied in a single act, the courage to step down from the throne and join the people in the work of survival. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the fires of the celebration had dimmed to a soft orange glow, Jackson sat alone on the terrace of the Grand Bastion. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was running away from anything. I used to think the universe was just one big machine with a lot of loose screws and leaking valves. I spent my life in the grease, thinking that as long as I kept the engines running and my casualty count at 0, I was doing my part. I looked at the high and mighty generals and their shining medals and thought they were the problem. And maybe they were, but I was hiding too. I was hiding in the footnotes of my own reports, thinking that staying small was the same thing as being safe. I thought courage was about the strength to hold a line in the sand. But I've learned it's actually about the will to change the line itself. It's easy to fire a gun when someone tells you to. It's hard to be the one who says no, because a single human life is worth more than a strategic position. I looked at that monolith and saw a god machine, but Alara saw a mirror. She saw that the wardens were only as powerful as our own fear. Looking at my hands now, they're still dirty, and they probably always will be. But the grease doesn't feel like a burden anymore. It feels like a choice. I'm not fixing things because I'm told to. I'm fixing them because I care about the people who use them. We've turned a fortress into a home and a cage into a choir. It's a fragile thing, this peace we've built, but it's a living thing. And for the first time, I think I've finally found a mission I'm not willing to extract myself from. He felt a presence beside him. Ilara sat down, her hand finding his in the dark. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The resonance between them was enough. The resonant was more than just a name now. It was a reality. A world where the Ran Gyoi Mong Men Gyua Jung Basai, the thin line between right and wrong, was no longer a source of fear, but a guide for action. They would make mistakes. They would face challenges. But they would do it together, with their eyes open and their hearts tuned to the frequency of mercy. Jackson looked out at the stars, at the infinite void that had once felt so hostile and cold. It didn't feel that way anymore. It felt like a neighborhood waiting for someone to build a bridge. "What are you thinking about?" Alara whispered. "I'm thinking about the next mission," Jackson said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mission 19. Objective: to build a school in Sector 12. Casualty target 0. He leaned back, the warmth of the coffee and the warmth of the woman beside him filling the space where the static used to be. The journey of the frontier scavenger was over. The journey of the architect of hope had begun. "I've spent my life pulling people out of fires, always looking for the quickest way to the exit. I thought courage was about the strength to hold a line, but I've learned it's actually about the will to change the line itself. So I wonder, in your own life, is there a wall you've been building to keep yourself safe that has actually become your cage? What would happen if you stopped reinforcing the bricks and started building a window instead?" Jackson Thorne took a slow, final sip of his coffee and set the cup down, his fingers already reaching for the small, worn wrench in his pocket as he watched the first true dawn of the resonant break over the horizon. A golden light touched the dormant monolith, turning its obsidian jaggedness into a shimmering beacon of peace.